We make our shots. We all do. That's what we do. That's what we do. And we keep doing it.
Good day, Jermaine. I love that intro. See how professional we are now. We're in the business of actually having professional conversations. One of the great things I love about you, Jermaine, is our conversations, and we have them on a weekly basis. And we generally talk shit about everything and everyone. But in this particular instance, I think we just need to talk about ourselves. We've got an image of yours in the background, and your practice I can only define in 2 words as post-documentary. It's broader than that, it's bigger than that, it's more than that. But we're in the time that we're in, we are post X and we are in Y. And who really knows what that means, because we're just living in the moment, and your shutter gets snapped as and when you take the idea and take yourself out into this world. That said, I've got this wonderful memory of the both of us walking through Brighton, and then we come across a road sign. And what's the road sign say? Just help me out with my memory and all that. What was it called again?
Oh my God, it was...
Was it like Black Boy Road or something?
Something like Black Boy Road or Black Boy Lane or something weird like that.
Yeah, it's usually a lane, isn't it? Usually Black Boy Lane.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we just lost our shit. We just started getting our cameras out and started shooting it to shit, like documenting this kind of ourselves in the British landscape. Because there we are, Black Boy Lane. It's like, oh my God, that could be me frolicking down the street, going to buy cigarettes from my nan. You know. But the point is, wasn't that like the affirmation that was like, we're both out in the British landscape? And it's certainly something that's featured in my book, Spirit Behind the Lens, out now on Zero Repeater Books, or available as pre-order on cheer.shop. That we had to discuss the landscape. We had to be a part of the British landscape, take our cameras out there with us. But what I loved about what you did is you put yourself in the landscape. You put the black figure in the landscape. Explain.
I guess it's not a new concept, because of course Ingrid did that in the beginning, Pollard. I guess when I was at university, I remember seeing Ingrid's work. I was at Derby at that point, and that would have been late 90s. And I remember, Derby and being in Derbyshire, it was really rural. Where I grew up in the West Midlands, there's this weird collapse at times of urban, and you can get to sort of like countryside really quickly. You can get to Wales pretty quickly from the West Midlands. And then my parents are both from the countryside in Jamaica. So there was always this weird, and when I went back to Jamaica, it was like the countryside. But then there was this weird thing where I'd be here and it would seem like an alien place, or a place that didn't really... my relationship was different. You'd have Darling Buds of May, you had all these other programs about this beautiful English countryside. But I never even really realised about a history and a relationship there. And it was always one which was a bit tense. You just didn't think you could be there. My dad, my dad's favourite places was, he did go to Barrow-in-Furness. He did some work up there as a builder. He really loved it. Because he said it reminded him of home. And home for him obviously was still Jamaica. So it was kind of quite a funny sort of relationship. And then seeing Ingrid's work, it was the first work that sort of talked to me and contextualized what I felt and what I understood and how I saw it. And it was a really important piece of work, and about my own relationship with me in space. Obviously this work sits within the rural, but my work was always about environment and about my relationship as a black figure, also with class dynamics, how I sat within that space, just existing in a space where you could be stopped. And just in where you lived, where you could be stopped and questioned. You could go into a shop and you'd be followed. So it always, it's an inevitable thing to think about space and what that means for a person you know, and I do mention also class dynamics, because also, like in Jamaica, you've got colorism, where, you know, if you're darker or lighter skinned, how you sit within the space of social economics, you know, who owns the land or who owns the money. Um, and I kind of sat between two worlds as well, because my mom is probably in the class system, probably upper, and my dad's not. And he was illiterate. But of course, what happens when you, as you know, when you come to countries, immigrants, to the outside world, that everything collapses into one, or defined as one thing, and internally, you know, those things aren't going. But that's kind of what happens. Um, and so for me, being in the countryside, I remember Marcia Michael was the year above me. She was one of the other black students. She was the year above me, a couple of years above me, and Marcia was really like helpful and just sort of negotiating. And also my lecturers were great as well. Like, you know, someone like John Blakemore, who's associated with that kind of romanticism and sort of spiritual thing in photography, and also with printing as well, and that kind of sort of methodology and his thinking. And it was actually also Lynn Silverman, who was American but was always interested in the landscape and as a woman and that relationship. But also I had lots of chats with her about conversations of existing and ideas of a sublime, and like, well, for me it's not, but awe might be, there might be an awe of the landscape, and because I enjoy it, but for me it couldn't just be a single thing, because of what it also meant about me being in that space. And then also what the historical ramifications are historically of how those spaces have some of those spaces have been created and what exists, and also what they then represent outside of something as a kind of formalistic um, engagement. I kind of got really interested, I think, around that point as well, by Rothko and the idea of a sublime, an idea of what, because you know the Bedman Burke sublime is very much about this kind of this kind of presentation of a sort of romanticism, which does, you know, remove things like class and race and gender, and also get to this kind of pure form of this kind of aesthetic taste. And then you have the Kantian version, and then you have the Leotard version of presenting a representable in postmodernism. But yeah, I was always interested in that idea of what happens when you're in a space and how it makes you feel, or how it can make you feel. Um, so I guess for me, going into the rural at this point, even though I'm always working in different spaces, it was about a mixture of things, like this black figure in this space, and why would that aesthetically seem out of place? Well, we know because of painting and years of history, and the way that sort of English nationalism tries to present this monolithic kind of homogenized version of an Englishness or of a landscape, which doesn't take into many different factors, and the pastoral especially. So that was sort of interesting for me, for all those aesthetic sort of dynamics within an image. And then also on top of that, what does, you know, that Stuart Hall talks about what is black in popular culture, and what does that mean to be black as a definition. You know, that word black is kind of great, but it's also it it also has to take on the properties of how we all, let's say about I'll say like the Caribbean diaspora, how that for us is also wrapped into so many different things of like colonialism and being brought up in the Caribbean. My parents and family members with this kind of English British sort of education and understanding, but then a shift to a sort of nationalism that comes in, and that kind of, and I was lucky because of spending time back in Jamaica. I saw a different representation of what I could be as opposed to what was being presented to me here. And I think photography itself is important. Like Bell Hooks talks about the family, that's why photography is important. In a sense, through your family albums, you can see a different representation of what is placed, let's say, in media and TV. And I got friends who are Irish and friends from other countries, and they talk about this family album as really important. And one of the things that was really telling for me, one of the things I always sort of remember is that my mom used to take photographs all the time. She's a little Kodak camera, really basic film in the back. I don't even think it has an f-stop on it really. It's just like really simple. And she used to go traveling to Amsterdam. She traveled to many countries and she just used to take photos. And there's photos of her and her friends in the landscape. And there's a really beautiful image of my mom in these gardens in Jamaica, which did the front gardens, and it's just like, and in the countryside. So it was sort of an interesting reference point that I'd had in my memory and my psyche, and I think I've only just really processed it and contextualized it. And I used that as some interesting material, but also the people in front of this lens or in this space, like in a storied ground, there are people who saw themselves, they would maybe call themselves as alternative, and what that meant within a culture, but it wasn't just this one way of looking and being, it could be many different ways. So it was kind of a sort of metaphor for that as well, play at that.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful to think about the many different ways, because I was always inspired by your approach to the countryside, but it was very different, but also mirrored in my own. So, for example, my mother grew up a peasant in West Africa, and she too was illiterate. And again, there's this thing about who owns the land and who works the land. And then also from her generation, having to escape the land because that was just drudgery. There was no future in the land. And so the sense that the land has no value, although in Africa particularly, it has huge mineral value. So no one cares for the yam that's grown on it or the animals that sit upon it. They only care for what's underneath and what can be exploited. Yeah. And then her own relationship to being exploited, to, you know, going into the village, going into the towns and working as a servant, and then making her way to this country to meet my father, who's the white working class proletariat. And what's devoid from every part of my life is the landscape. It's something to be run away from. And so when it came to sort of me engaging with the landscape, I think I approached it from a position of methodology, as you say, like how you use print and material to represent this landscape that's almost been portrayed in paintings and nationalism. And then for me to sort of get into the countryside and discover there's nothing there. It's just barren. It's got nothing. It's got a village, a pub, a post office, monocrops everywhere. Very little in the way of life or diversity, just sheep or cows, maybe an alpaca, maybe another pub, and then a motorway, and then this liminal bastard countryside between the city and the landscape. And just been left with this having to add things to the narrative, or my photography became more dramatic. I started looking at Mark Fisher and the idea of hauntology and the idea of using older, out-of-date materials to represent a countryside that's kind of not there anymore. There is literally lone trees dotted everywhere. And to me, a barren landscape with sheep on it is not a countryside. It's just, it's kind of, there's nothing there. And it bothered me, and it really bothered me. And it bothered me because I did it in 2016, the year England chose Brexit as its protest vote, just to find the Brexiteers, the people who voted for it out in the countryside, just having no, just equally as, there's, again, you don't make anything, you've got nothing to sell. What we do in London is create culture and put that on. It's just a weird place, because what few forests there were are gone, and that essentially was used to build boats that was then used to then get off the island to then create this empire, and with that came a mythology. And probably in my head, I sort of rested on this book that I found in Martin Parr's library, and it was a Faye Godwin portrayal of the English countryside with poems by Ted Hughes. And even that was just projected values and projected realities. Even the photography and the printing was all beautifully made and beautifully projected onto paper. But it felt like I was walking through mythology, like the Cotswold is just a well-branded village somewhere. Yeah, I couldn't get my head around it.
I think it's the thing of it, and that's what I was, talking about. There's this, the because of the way that nationalism, and I'm going to say English nationalism,
Exactly,
has used the aesthetic of that, and it's a middle class project anyway. That kind of sense of romanticism and pastoral. The people who, that's the thing about the countryside and the rural. There's the people who are the working classes there, who exist and have this ecosystem that's in, we all talk about the post-industrialism. Well, then, that's people forget about farming became industrialized, and that money, in some ways, which also came from the colonies, created this new wealth, which allowed the gentry to remove the rights of poor people from the land and then build trees. It's all a constructed thing. I mean, I think my relationship with the countryside is quite funny, because I have friends who are from the countryside who I met through my life, and I spent time there. And I really enjoyed being in this space as a sense of a play with them, but they were my friends. But I've had experiences, obviously. I've had experience with people also who are like white as well, being in those places, and that you're an outsider. And then I'm definitely an outsider, because kind of, it's really interesting reading about, the idea of racism in the rural. I forgot the name of the author, but it's a brilliant book. The authors, and they talk about the idea of this prejudice in the countryside. So in Wales, in parts of Wales, it's very different. And it's also about the idea of when a lot of people think that the black existence here is always based around Windrush, which is totally untrue, as we know. In Wales, there's been a black existence for a long time. So it said, some people said, well, yeah, we didn't get the racism because everyone was racist towards the English. So you had this kind of strange dichotomy going on. Not saying, but there's also the thing, it does go on, it's whether you acknowledge that or not, or see that. But that racism also a bit like, well, we hate the English more kind of thing. I read that book and it was really interesting and funny. But then you hear about certain attitudes and values of, that flights that went from the West Midlands by those nationalists. The National Front went to Wales. They wanted to create a utopia. And they took a lot of their attitudes, which they took from the urban to the rural. And those ideas that it's the last bastion of protection of sort of an English culture, which is always mythological and boy myth, like we know St. George, not even English.
yeah, absolutely. I think I was reminded of that when I was in North Wales, and seeing the sort of colonization of the Brummies taking over North Wales with their caravan parks and their values as well, which I thought was really interesting. And I sort of walked with that. I took that in, but I just realized that maybe I need to go more towards the regions. And so when I ended up in Ireland and Scotland, again, there's a shift in the politics, and it really, again, it brought into the bear this Englishness, this English domination of the regions, and then ultimately the world. It started here first, and walking through some fjord in Ireland just to come across a random memorial of some people who died potentially in the 19th century of starvation because the local English landowner starved them to death. For whatever reason, that was the power they had.
Well, we do also have to remember the Scottish as well built a lot of their infrastructure and their existence through slave money as well.
Yeah.
I have basically roots that probably go back to Scotland as well at some point.
Yeah.
Because the amount of Scottish who were in Jamaica as well, who were part of that trade. So You know, that whole conversation is, or as much as it's based around England, Scotland does have a hell of a lot because of the economics. But in sense of the countryside, you know, and that's the thing. There was I was on a conversation on another sort of podcast, you know, talking about the realities of the countryside. You know, there's photographers out there who are documenting what's actually going on you know, that kind of what's going on in the current and what's going on in this kind of, as Gilroy talks about, this sort of melancholy.
Yeah.
You know, this sort of English melancholy. You know, what's going on is like Joanna Coates, you know, photographer who works as, you know, on a farm and makes photography and documents this existence. And their imagery was really interesting in the sense of showing that you know, the diversity of people picking the fruit, farming the land, you know, on so, you know, this kind of mythology that it's just basically a monoculture is untrue. And that's what nationalism does. It tries to create a monoculture. It tries to say that things aren't diverse in order to sell a aesthetic representation. You see how Brexit did that very well, you know, and also, you know, Paul Redmond talks about that in A Storied Ground, and in Storied Ground about these spaces like the White Cliffs of Dover and things like that have been used to enforce a sort of idea of representation of Englishness. And so I think there's an idea, and that was the thing about photography, and you talk about Faye Goodwin and people like that, but although I understand their premise, I was always more into sort of like Ray Williams, who was seemed to be looking at the raw in a very different way. He was saying it's not this romanticized, but, you know, he was showing road signs and these kind of spaces. And I always thought he was really interesting how he did that with Ray Moore, not Williams, Ray Moore. Sorry, I always get names mixed up. It was going to be about Raymond Williams, and talking about this idea of culture. But yeah, I remember those photographers, and I remember John, you know, talking about the work. And I always really liked John's work, Blakemore's work as well. But also there was the thing where, for me, and maybe because of my sensibilities, you know, I was interested in Friedlander, what he was doing in America with, you know, when he did America by car.
Yeah.
Talking about, you know, photograph from a car, and he's showing this change, you know, this American capitalism in the landscape, and he goes, this is now America. That kind of like Midwest, whatever image is not true anymore.
Yeah.
I thought that, you know, I was always interested in how he could collapse this kind of space and time within a frame. And I thought that was always a strategy I felt was super interesting. It's what I mean. Friedlander was the person who inspired me to take pictures as a photographer. It was always Lee Friedlander. The first time I saw that book, like A One-Eyed Cat, I was mesmerized. I was like, here's this guy, and he's making these images, and, you know, there was some people going, oh, it's just formalism, and obviously you go, well, there's no form about content, and there was always something else going on in his image, and I thought it was really smart. And he just got a 35mm as well, which I really loved. It wasn't like he was on the 4.5, which I'd seen with other photographers, and it was like this whole thing. He was there on the street, 35mm, you know, making, you know, those self-portraits. And I just thought, yeah, it really made me think about how it's like a collage.
Yeah.
Within this frame. And there's so many different bits going on. If you don't look, if you don't sort of interrogate it, you kind of miss them.
Yeah.
I think that's why people like, you know, Martha Rosler and people like that, really, an artist really look at, you see a lot of conceptual artists, you know, Stan Douglas said that it was interesting hearing him on a podcast, and he said, who's your favourite photographer? And he said, Lee Friedlander. And I didn't expect that to come from Stan Douglas. And you realise a lot of conceptual photographers really, really respect Lee Friedlander.
It's funny because of Lee Friedlander is the reason why I got the 35mm, 24mm lens and found myself shooting into the sun whenever I could on the street with all these different components going on. Less of the decisive moment and more of the undecided moment, the thing between the frame, not the actual banging frame itself. But his influence is really subliminal, and in my head he merges in with Robert Frank and a load of what I call the great black and whiters. But I think that sense of transparency is really important. It's becoming almost a hallmark of like what we may now call working class photography. This sense of let's keep it that wide view. It's the wide angle view. For me, the 24mm lens, it's as is, almost as is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's. I think I don't know if it's if I would put it as a class thing, but I definitely think that what Friedlander did was there was a kind of a sort of thing that made me think about Friedlander. But I can go into the world with a 35mm, which is really accessible, and I can basically, because of course I grew up in Tipton, really working class post-industrial town. You know, it's and it was my mum's. My mum was a health visitor in Sandwell, so that whole area has a particular demographic. Galton Bridge Estate, all those places up into Smethwick, into like Dudley. You know, there was a lot of, and it was mainly it was a strange kind of place to grow up because it was mainly white working class. But when I look at my school pictures, my years, well, my generation, maybe the generation above, was like really sort of mixed in the sense of, we had, Sikh, Hindu, sort of Pakistani Muslim. We had kids, so we had this community going on, Bengali. Then we had some Chinese sort of kids. There was, black kids as well. I mean, and so it was like a really strange kind of mix. I remember our football team, Tipton Boys, was such a motley crew. We won the leagues and everything because it was like we played we played in a lot of middle class leagues in the area for some reason. Our manager Jock, he was called Jock and he was Scottish. He was from Glasgow. He was fucking proper stereotype, but he was great. He was really amazing, man. He was proper disciplined. Like if you didn't come training the day before, you were on the bench. No matter how good a player you was, you're on the bench. You turn up to training. And, he really, and we played in some places and we were just this mixture of kids from different, proper motley crew. I mean, Aggie was from, the goalkeeper was from the estate in Princess End and a few. So it was a mixture of, it's cut into two halves, different halves, Tipton Green, Great Bridge, Princess End. And we all seemed to play for the same team, but we were at rival schools, which could be problematic. My cousin was at the rival school and there was always a history between them. Like the kids came from sort of the Tibby, the Lost City, which was a traveller sort of like area, which we had traveller friends as well. So it was quite a sort of mad mix of sort of kids growing up, as in this weird like melting pot of children. And yeah, I mean, Jock was amazing because we'd go off to places, and it was really interesting. I got a lot of racism on the pitch of some parents, and Jock would not stand for it at all. He would be straight over to the ref, and then he'd be straight over to the. And he was a pretty formidable. He was always in a wax jacket and steel toe cap boots. I think he'd worked on the docks. He was hard. He was a hard man. And we went to Glasgow as well. We did like little football exchange with Glasgow with Jock. So I had a weird sort of like pen friend in Glasgow. And so it was quite, that football team and athletics started to see the world a bit differently and go to Somerset and go to places. And I got to see England through sports. That's wow. I got to see England and Britain through playing football with his team. And then athletics kind of took me totally everywhere. and opened up. And I didn't really take any photographs at all, which I'm really sad about. But I just wasn't into photography. I was into films. That's what I was into. It was like escapism.
Yeah.
I used to watch Movie Drome all the time because it was amazing. I remember always watching. What was the show? The Late Show. I used to love. I mean, it was quite mad because actually,
Did you have your own TV in your bedroom?
I did in the end, yeah, but I wasn't allowed for a while. Well, I just had the TV, but I could stay up and watch TV. My dad used to probably go to bed at night because he'd be up early going to the building site because he was a taper. And my mom would probably, so they'd sort of let me stay up and watch because they knew it was weird. It was like, yeah, you can watch the Late Show, you can watch Movie Drome.
South Bank show on a Sunday night.
They thought, yeah, get to watch the South Bank show.
And Spitting Image. That would have been important then.
Yeah, I got a bit of Spitting Image as well, which is kind of funny because it was like, I guess my household wasn't a overtly political household, although in a bit, I don't know if it's that true. I mean, my dad watched the news. He'd watch the 6 o'clock news, then he'd watch 9 o'clock. I'd be like, but we've seen this before. Obviously, we watched like Maurice Stewart would be on BBC,
Legend.
and then he'd get like Trevor McDonald in. It was just funny because it was like, yeah, look at these people who you want to be, these are the people you want to be like. And then, yeah, we'd always be watching like, I don't know, Panorama, like all these new current affairs programs. My dad wasn't, but obviously I didn't realise he couldn't. He was pretty illiterate.
Yeah.
But he was always, and my mom as well, because also she was working in, working in the NHS, and especially where she was health visiting, her job, she really visited some really poor estates. And that was a job, and she did some amazing stuff like help create creches. So I learned a lot about environment and space for them, and also about the idea of their attitude was like, you have to, there are people having existences which aren't yours, and you need to understand what is their perspective as well. Yes. You might not agree with their perspective, but engage in it. And so my mom's job was that as well. She had to engage in those perspectives. She had to sort of dissect, and she saw probably some really, really rough stuff, in a day-to-day level, being a health visitor. When I look at Richard Billingham's Raise a Laugh, I know my mum visited those places. And she was always this thing about you never be judgmental in that sense. She was always talking about education and talking about how people, you're lucky because you've got an insight into the world that we've given you. And, my dad was probably, always it's not that he wasn't, my dad was political in the sense of he wasn't out marching on the streets, but he was very aware. Like, he had this thing about, yeah, unions are great, but, as a black person, an immigrant ain't great, it doesn't always work for you. But he also understood the importance of the miners' strike and what that meant. And I remember that really being imprinted on my brain, watching that. And so this not being my imagery, and I think like Shoaib sort of mentioned it to me, because your imagery, and I think Brad said, your imagery, Brad Fowler said, seem to have a relationship to a TV screen. I do photography like I'm remind me of a TV screen. One of those sort of 80s, 90s. I think we had a Hitachi.
That's a good television to have at the time, full color then.
Good TV,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. So, and videos. So, yeah, TV really was, because I was an only child as well, but then I had lots of cousins. So
did you manage to decouple your TV from the aerial into a computer or an Atari or something else? Use the TV
upstairs. So I used to have, so my downstairs was like the TV, and in my dad's room, which was like which sort of had his guitar. My dad was a big. He used to play acoustic, electric. Um, he had his little man cave with his sort of, because my dad used to rig up sound systems as well for people, help with speakers, of course, you know, and he grew up in West Bromwich, and so he had the most beautiful Fender he had a beautiful Fender catalogue. It was amazing. I used to look at it all the time. It was a fairy tale. It was based on fairy tales. They did these whole illustrations. So that was it. So I had this straight, I don't know, my auntie as well, who was the art teacher. So she used to take me to galleries and she gave me Dune to read. So I loved
Wow.
the cover.
Yeah,
So
of course.
she always had great album covers. And then at the house, we had amazing albums because my dad was big into music. Obviously, he was into Burning Spear. You know, I'm so gutted. We don't know where it went, but he had the Wailers album where it was the Clipper.
Yeah, the lighter.
Lighter one.
Open, yeah.
And he had like Stevie Wonder. He was really into music, and I wasn't allowed to touch the hi-fi downstairs. You're not allowed to touch that. So I guess that's where music had a massive influence as well, because we had this whole thing. My mom liked soul, and we watched Top of the Pops all the time. So, but then I used to watch the chart show.
Yeah.
So I had all this visual imagery as well from the record covers.
Yeah, yeah.
They're amazing. And then my dad had like bits of American country and Western music,
Of
which
course.
really funny.
Yeah, of course.
He did have a Richard Clayderman, who's just on about the arrangement because the arrangement was amazing. So he had sort of strange, not strange, that's wrong. He had this really amazing sort of avenue into different musics because he played the guitar. If it was string, I'm going to respect it. It was sort of quite a funny. It was a thing. So thinking about like the post-industrial dreamscape is a sort of a weird amalgamation of all those things as well that I grew up with in as a kid at home. You know, with all music, as you know, is always a massive thing, and you sort of like TV, just visuals. And my dad loved planting. My mom and dad love gardening as well. My mom loves her things are roses.
Yeah.
So we had a patch because so basically my mom said the soil's really good because it was on old mining land, and the soil was really good. So we had a patch in the garden where we grow tomatoes, like different vegetables, and that was my job to water them. I spent a lot of time in this like place, and then my dad was putting up trees, and so it was like we had a lot of sort of. They weren't going to the countryside, but they were bringing the countryside into the house or into the garden, ferns, stuff like that. So yeah, it was sort of a kind of a strange sort of upbringing in that house as of influences.
But also this sense of being on the liminal side of British life, not in the big urban city centres, but right on the edge where, like you said, the mining, the soil is good. Only, Jamaicans know their way around soils. Jamaicans know their way around gardening. And also every Jamaican I've ever known has a Scottish surname. There's all these things that are part and parcel of that island meeting this island, and how you, within all that, pulls the camera out and starts to document, starts to pull together this way of seeing as well as this way of being, and being black in the rural widdles, and to a certain extent. I'm very much urban. I only ever encountered the countryside as part of school trips up until 2016. I never went out there. I would go to Gatwick Airport and catch a plane and go to other countries, but I would never encounter that. And you grew up in that, which is why I always find the parallels quite beautiful in terms of having the same television sets, watching the same things, perhaps not the same things on the weekends because we had London weekend television, which you guys didn't have, which meant we were watching the Terrorhawks every morning on a Saturday. I don't know
No,
about
we used to get Terrorhawks as well because we get London weekend television as well because they franchise it all out.
I
Because
see.
we had like, so you'd still get like Starfleet and Terrorhawks and Buck Rogers.
and yeah, and oh my god. So yeah, so these parallels are there, but at the same time, that sense of experience, that sense of jock, that sense of the team, that image particularly struck me because I was in Wales recently. I went to Tiger Bay. I wanted to look for like the oldest Somalian restaurant in the country, knowing that they would have had Somalian restaurants in Tiger Bay in the 1930s. Of course, there's nothing there. It's all bulldozed. It's all gone, except for one random picture in a random museum of a random Tiger Bay school, and it's a school shot, and there's every race represented, and it's 1934.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. This is the thing I always talk about. The idea of Windrush, in some ways, is beautiful, but then it's been used to center and create a history that's false. You know, when I did A Pleasant Land, you know, obviously two of those images are in Dulwich, Lisa's show, Soulscapes. You know, the whole premise of that was going into the archive. You know, like Stuart talks about the archive being, it's like a living, so it's living, and you know, to find. And there's a great book about the Oxford sort of alumni who this writer sort of wrote about. I read a lot about the stuff of the black alumni and who have been at Oxford, and to find all these black sort of people who are not documented in the sense of they're photographed, but there are no names, where they're from, and to create that imagery, you know, it's quite important to talk about these undocumented black figures who've been there since what, before 1950, 1960. They've been there for years, and it's important because what it talks about is that if you want to present a country that is in demise in the way that sort of nationalists do, or I'd say on the right of the country, the ills of his country are based on the ideas of purely immigration and not policy, and not the idea of historical things like the end of empire, which means you can't have resources or labour for free, and resources to extract for economic gain in sort of you know, you could say global capitalism. If you're basically saying that no policy since post-industrialism has affected the poor and the working classes by taking away the economy, and if you shape the working classes as just a white monoculture, indigenous, and if you just frame it that it was because a wave of people came over a certain period of time from colonies, then you can shape a narrative like that. But if you've got a narrative which says, no, this country has been immigration for years, there have been, you know, black people in the military, you know, that it's all we've added. There's people who have been of brown skin from all colonies, from India, you know, from all over the world, who've contributed to this country culturally and economically, then you can't make that argument. And so for me, when people talk about black history, I say, well, black history may be black history, but it's British history, it's European history, it's world history. It's intertwined, it's not a separate thing. And when you start thinking of these narratives and the temporalities of history, then you then can talk about, well, what has happened, what has gone on. And I know that, you know, you hear some, you know, like David Starkey, you know, like he's claiming he doesn't want to talk, you know, basically you don't want to talk about the realities of this country, because if you separate them out, then you can have this false narrative. But if you place them together to say, well, hang on, you know, there was basically a trade that allowed that money to then mass amount of money to come in and fuel an economy, which then allow through a navy and through certain companies, East India Company, places like that, and that money came back to people in this country to build more wealth and build cities. Then you have to have real conversations, like just about history. It's just history, and I find it really interesting that people. And the problem is that histories are complicated. And I think there are people as well, and I'm not just talking about it. I'm talking also of members of the left who also have their own vested interest. You don't want to talk about other it's like my dad said about unions. Well, that's unions were really racist. They voted for policies to basically keep people, immigrants, out of jobs in the 70s. He said that's a reality. It's a legacy that they've got to understand and deal with as well. So I'm just interested in having complicated conversations because the world is complicated. It's not always linear. It's sometimes, it's difficult. Talking about, say, like, I gave a lecture the other day to some students at LCC, and I was talking about the idea of, Frans Fanon's really interesting, but we also have to talk about Cabana Mercer's critique of his vision of blackness doesn't involve women as victims. Doesn't mean that Frans Fanon shouldn't be talked about or the ideas shouldn't be talked about. We just talk about, well, there are these things involved as well, and that shapes the way a person talks and presents a reality. And I guess it's the same with my imagery. There will be people who will say, like, years to come, well, that was shaped from a very particular position and a place in time, or context. But so I think works are also living as well. I think that sometimes we have this idea, maybe in photography, and it's interesting in photography terms. I think photography is interesting in lens-based media, but it's not this like fixed signifier always. That sometimes it does have the ability to change an archive, a photograph, what was in the moment, then is looked back upon and then seen maybe differently when maybe we know the historical and the contextual things going at the time, or even yourself when you've made an image or made a project. Sometimes not till afterwards that you really, really understand where it sat or where it ended up.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really powerful point. And I wanted to almost leave it there, the complex conversations as being the theme of this particular talk, and the complexity of our surface level, certainly on my side, on my surface level interpretation of the landscape, but also your relationship to the landscape, your history, and ultimately the conversations that come from trying to put this on paper and make it work on the wall, as many of your bodies of work is. It ends up on paper and books and on walls. And that said, I want to thank you for this conversation and for the start of a series of complex conversations that we'll be carrying forward. But as with everything else, time and chance is operating against us right now. We've hit our hour mark. So I want to thank you, Jermaine, and please let me know what's going on in the future this year, particularly for you, so we can keep engaging in these conversations.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, just to show at Oxford, and I'm showing some new work, Peckham 24, which I'm excited about, also apprehensive, which is about the gospel in racial time, which I'll leave it at that, and people can come and see it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm excited about it's sort of a living work that's going to continue and grow. So it's got some controversy to it, which we all love a bit of that.
We love a bit of controversy.
We'll see. Yeah. But no, thank you for inviting me to have a chat. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. I honestly thought it was going to be one of our Banton conversations, but actually it's kind of required that we have to speak on things seriously in a way that we're sort of sharing ideas and thoughts with a community that we need to continue to have these conversations and grow. We need to move on. It's 2016 seems to linger in our lives to this day, and that somehow has to come to an end.
I think it's just, it's that thing that I thought was interesting in Carrie Mae Weems' show was about, actually it's just trying to find a better way to exist. None of us want to be having these, we just try and find a better way to exist. And unfortunately, the people who are the victims and suffer are usually the ones who don't profit from vested interest of others. That's always been something that I've always been aware of, and especially more recent years. So yeah, it's just my attitude is to try and create a dialogue or a conversation for us to try and get to a better way, because it's fucking boring.
Yeah, agreed. Adam, you got any thoughts on this?
I could unload and everything about leotard and landscapes and how bad British unions have been, particularly around 1910s on these issues. But I will leave it there. I will let people sit with this conversation. It's not,
no, honestly,
it's not for
Adam,
anyone. Yeah,
I just wanted to say, Adam, I kind of love the idea of your sort of like you're the voice that's been in the background, and then you jump in and just actually, what was your take on our talk? Because I want to hear your take on it.
Good.
Because as you said, it gets hard.
A bit.
Sorry.
I mean, I quite like sort of the opening sort of thrust of clearing, essentially establishing that every landscape is a mythology. That the mythology is built into the ground itself, and even if you capture it, in capturing, you're still filtering through some of that mythology. Present not necessarily because mythology is inherently bad, but you got to present like counter mythologies. There's kind of a ceremony. I couldn't help but think about, for example, the work of like Sylvia Wynter, like Black Metamorphosis, particularly when you're talking about. And he was talking about, the value underneath the ground and the yams, and it's this distinction that Winter brings up between the plot on the plantation as the real site of production. It's that distinction that creates these new kind of indigeneities, and then of course how that becomes dispersed throughout, yours and Jermaine's work across the rural and the urban divide. And plug for repeat, I couldn't help but think about as well some of our recent books, like Vron's book on that exact thing. So. Sorry, folks. Coming out of nowhere, the other discussion. This is the hidden hand here. But no, I just want to say I really loved it listening to it.
I appreciate you, Adam. Honestly, it was a great conversation, Jermaine. It's a great conversation all around.